Hi, I'm Jim Hoskins, and in this workshop, we'll be learning about AngularJS. Angular is a JavaScript framework for building complex web applications in the browser. Angular differs from other frameworks like Backbone, where Backbone requires you to maybe write a lot of JavaScript code to interact with your page. Angular takes some different approaches where we actually have a more declarative syntax where we really interact with our HTML and write very little JavaScript. Now, what we're going to be doing is a little bit involved, so I'm going to assume you know a little bit of HTML and CSS and JavaScript to get started, but we got a lot to cover and not a lot of time to do it, so we're going to dive right in. You can learn about AngularJS at angularjs.org and at the docs site of docs.angularjs.org. The application we're going to be building is going to consume the Dribble API. Now, typically, when we do a JavaScript framework, we build a to-do list application, but that's been done to death, and I'm sure you can find some great examples of how to create a to-do list application with Angular using Google. Really easy to find. So instead, I want to build on top of the Dribble API and create a single-page application that consumes the Dribble API. So I actually have an example of our application that we're going to be building right here, and this is what we're going to be going for. And we can see it has a list of the recent Dribble posts, and we can go to different lists like everyone and debuts and drill in to an actual page itself and see the information and things like comments. Now, hopefully we'll be able to get all of these covered, but we're going to be starting from scratch and building it up as we learn AngularJS. I chose the Dribble API because it's really easy to use. It doesn't require any sign up. It's pretty small, pretty easy to understand, and pretty easy to utilize. And it offers JSONP, which allows us to consume the API regardless of what server we're hosted on directly from our browser. You can take a look at the Dribble API at dribble.com/API and get some information about the different endpoints and the types of information that it sends. But before we do that, let's just learn a little about AngularJS itself. Here I have our AngularJS app that we're going to start with, and I'm hosting it using a small Python script, but it's just normal HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so you could use Apache to host it or whatever solution you prefer. I'm going to show you what our application framework looks like. So we have a few files and folders. Basically, we have our index.html, and right now it's a pretty basic page, and we're going to be building on Twitter Bootstrap to get started. And this will allow us to, have some nice formatting without spending too much time designing. Then we have a few folders here. We have a partials directory, which we'll see later, and we have our lib directory, and this is where our actual angular.js file exists. Now, right now there are some extra Angular files, but really we're just going to be using the angular.js file, which we've included at the bottom here through lib angular angular.js. We also have our bootstrap, which we've included through our style sheets here, and I've added a basic nav bar at the top. Inside the JS directory is where our files are, and we just have 5 different JS files, and all of which are empty except for the use strict command, which will kick our JavaScript into strict mode, which will help us catch some errors. But right now, they're all empty. If we look at index.html, we can see they're just included in app, services, controllers, filters, and directives. Then we have some CSS, and I've just written some CSS styles for our application. So let's get started with sort of the hello world of Angular applications. In order to make Angular work on this page, we need to do something to the HTML tag. What we're going to do is add a new attribute called ng-app. Angular works through directives, which are expressed as HTML tags, attributes, and even CSS classes. And that's how it hooks into our code and knows what we want to do. ng-app is an attribute that specifies where our app exists on the page. Since we want our app to take up the entire page, we're going to put the attribute on the HTML tag itself. If we wanted to restrict our app to a specific div on the page, we could move the ng-app directive down into that div. But that will trigger our app to start up. So if I save it out and we refresh, we don't get anything. So let's go ahead and write some code. So inside of here, I'm going to just create a simple h1 that says hello world. Now this is just basic static code in our HTML, and if we refresh, we can see it just shows up like that. But now let's replace world with something dynamic. So I'm going to replace this, and we'll say, instead of having world, we'll do name. Now you'll notice what I did is wrapped it in double curly braces, and this is the syntax we use for adding dynamic content into our HTML content with AngularJS. Inside of the curly braces is the piece of code, or in this case, the variable that we want to have expressed in that place. So if we save it out, we're going to see that world disappears, but we don't see the curly braces. That's because what Angular has done is it has tried to take the value of name, which happens to be nothing at this point, and place it where those curly braces were. And since there's nothing, we just see it gone. So you'll notice that the curly braces are gone. That means Angular is working, and we just don't have any data. So let's change that. Under our H1, I'm going to add an input tag of type text, and we will give it another attribute, and we'll use ng-model. This is another built-in attribute for Angular, and what it does is it takes another expression, for instance, our name variable, and it binds the value of our input to that variable in both directions. So as we fill in our input, it's going to update our name variable to have the value of our input. Likewise, whenever name changes, it's going to update the input field with the latest value. So it works in both directions. Now on line 18, where we use the name variable, not only is it placing the current value into our HTML when we load it, but it's actually watching that name variable, and every time it changes, it's going to re-render the page with that new value. So let's see it in action. So if we refresh, we can see the page. Now we saw before a little flicker where we saw our curly braces. That's what we see before Angular kicks in and actually compiles the page. There are ways to remove that flash so people don't see it, but we're going to just skip over right now and assume that Angular boots up instantly. So now we have our input and our H1, and since there was no value for name, they're both empty. But if we start typing, we can see immediately, as we type, the name variable is updated in both places. So as we type, the name variable is being updated via the ng-model attribute in our input, and by updating name, it actually updates the value of the H1. So how do we make our name have a default value? Well, there are a couple of different ways to do it, but one of the core components of Angular is something called a controller. And a controller manages some portion of our application, or a scope, on our page. And as you might guess, we'll set it up in our controllers.js file. Now, a controller in its simplest form is simply a function. So we can create a function, and we'll call it app control. And in AngularJS, typically our controllers end with CTRL as just a convention, but you can call it anything you want. And we'll right now take no arguments. So remember, our controllers.js is being loaded. So if we refresh, we can actually see app control is defined in the global scope. So how do we add a controller to the page itself? Well, we open up our index.html, and then on the element we want our controller to be scoped to, we add an ng-controller attribute. I'm going to add it to our body, so this particular controller has scope over our entire body of our page. Inside of our body, I'll add ng-controller. And then all we have to do is pass it the name of our controller. Now we don't see any change yet, but that's because we want to actually update the value of name inside of that scope using a controller. So when Angular sees the ng controller, it actually finds this function and creates a new controller to be associated with it by running that function. So one thing that we can do is we can add an argument here called scope. And that's $scope. And we can assign variables to it. And this is the actual scope where things like that name variable are stored. So we can literally say scope.name equals world with some exclamation points. So now if we run it, we can see that because the controller was instantiated before we did anything, the name was set to the value world. And that means world shows up in both the H1 and the input because they're both referring to the name value. And as we change it, it still updates. In fact, our scope.name would also have the new value. Now, this scope argument that's passed to app control is actually very special, and it's another great feature of of AngularJS called dependency injection. You see, in different controllers and other types of modules that we'll create, we'll need to depend on things like the current scope or other modules that provide different functionality. And the way that we include those is through dependency injection through function arguments. And what Angular does is it actually looks at the argument names of these functions and tries to figure out what value should be placed into them. So it's actually looking at our argument list. It sees $scope, and built in, it knows what $scope is and what its value should be. And we'll see as we add more that it looks up the correct value to be passed by name. So as we add more dependencies to this particular controller, we can have them in any order so long as the names match up. So let's just do one more thing. We can actually add sort of anything to our scope, including functions. So we'll say scope.update name equals a function. And then from in here, we could just say scope.name equals world from function. And in order to execute this, we can use another directive. So I'm going to add a button. And in order to execute something when we click the button, we'll use another built-in attribute called ng-click. And this is different from the onClick event. Anytime you want to interact using events, there are built-in Angular event handlers like ng-click, ng-doubleclick, ng-mouseover, and so on for you to use instead that will properly update your code. So in here, we're still in the same scope, so that method that we created on the scope, update name, can be just placed in here, update name, and executed. So if we refresh, we now have this button, and if we click it, we can see that it's able to update the scope just like anything else. Now, one thing that we've done here is we've created our controller using a global function. We've created a global variable app control, which is our function, and referred to it by name here. However, that's not ideal. Instead, we want to use something called modules in Angular. And modules are the core component of how we organize and manage our code. Now, while this way is easy, it quickly becomes a mess, so we're going to switch to it as soon as we can. Now, the first step is to actually update our ng app directive and give it a value. And this is the name of our main module that represents our application. We'll call it dabble with 3 B's. So if we were to just run this, we're going to get an error immediately, and we see no module dabble. So in order to fix that, in our app.js, I'm going to define our dabble module. And we'll say var app equals, and in order to define the module, we'll do angular.module and give it the name, dabble. And the second argument is the list of modules it depends on. Right now, we're going to leave it empty, and we're just going to have the one module. So now if we refresh, we see that it still works. So what happens if we delete our app controller here? We're going to get an error, meaning that app control is not a function defined. So we're actually going to create different modules for our controllers versus our main application. Then what we'll do is we'll say our main application requires our controllers module as a dependency. So we're actually, in each of our files, going to create a separate module. So I'll say var controllers equals, and we'll do the same thing, angular.module. And this name can be anything, but I'm going to namespace it under dabble by saying dabble.controllers and passing an empty array of other modules that it requires. Then we can say on our controllers module, there's a function called controller, which is how we define a controller as part of a module. The first argument is the name of the controller. We'll say app control. And the second is a function that is our controller. Now we can make this an anonymous function. And this is just like our previous function where we can add things like scope right here and say scope.name equals module, just so we get a different message. Now we're almost there. If we refresh, we still have the same issue. It can't find app control. That's because our app is loading up our dabble module, and our controller is defined in our dabble.controllers module. And that's where this dependency array comes in. What we can do is give it a name of the modules that should be included, like dabble.controllers. So by including this module, we should now have the app controller that we defined available to us, and it works, and we can see it's executing properly. So let's actually get into the API for Dribbble and start trying to display some data. So if we take a look at the API, the first endpoint that we want to look at is the shots/list. And this is shots/debuts, everyone, and popular. Right now, we're just going to worry about loading the data from the popular list. And you can see an example of the data that it returns currently. So let's go to our controller, and I'm actually going to create a new controller for handling our list. And to do that, I'll just do controllers.controller. And we'll say it's a shots list control. And this, again, just takes a function. So I want to assign to scope.list, and I want it to be the return value of this API call. So in order to do that, I need to add a couple of arguments to our shotlist controller. First, we need the scope, and the second is a module that's built in called HTTP, and that's stored under $HTTP. Now, it doesn't matter which order we have these arguments in, because it looks it up by name. If we passed HTTP first and then scope, Angular would pass the appropriate values in the appropriate order based on the name of our variables. So what we can do is do http.jsonp. And this loads via a script tag and a callback, but it's all done transparently, so it feels like a normal AJAX call. And what it does is it takes a URL. In this case, it's going to be http api.dribbble.com. And the path that we need to do is /shots/popular. So we'll do /shots/popular. And this returns something called a promise. And because our data is going to be loaded asynchronously, we don't have the data right away. Instead, we need to use a callback. And the way we hook into it is we have this promise object that has a .then method. And this is what we pass a function, which is our callback to. Now, this function is going to receive as its argument the actual data from the API. So I'll just call it data. And if we go in here and do just console.log data, we should see that it hopefully will actually query the Dribbble API and log the data to our console. So let's try it out. And it's actually not going to work because we haven't instantiated a shots list controller. So we actually need to do that in our HTML. And I'm going to remove all this code from the Hello World example. And we'll create a div, and we'll give it ng controller equals shots list control. So now that there's actually a shots list control defined in our HTML, Angular will instantiate a shots list controller. So now we just have a syntax error. And that's because JSONP requires a callback function. If we take a look at the AngularJS documentation for the $HTTP module right here, and we take a look at the JSONP method, we actually have to define somewhere in our string JSON callback in all caps. This is the name of the JSONP callback that will pass to Dribbble. And if we take a look at the JSONP documentation here, we'll see that the name of that function should be in the callback parameter. So we'll update our URL here, and we'll say callback equals JSON callback. Now, before Angular sets it out, it's going to set up the callback and replace it with the name. So when it sends it out, it will patch the data through as expected. And let's go back to our actual one that we're working on. And now we see our object logged. And this is our data object. And we can see it as config, data, headers, and status. And our data is stored inside of the data property. And we can see shots right there. So let's work on getting this onto the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say scope.list equals data.data. So what this will do is it will update the scope list to be the actual response from our JSON call. Now, anytime this data is updated, it's actually going to update our HTML based on the new data. So let's actually write some HTML to handle it. I'm going to take a look at my existing code just to make sure I get the right code set up, but let's just create a div. We already have it. And I'll create a UL class equals thumbnails. And inside, we want a list item of thumbnail. And we're going to place each of the individual shot data inside of this LI. So how do we get an LI for each and every one of our shots in our list.shots variable? Well, what we do is we use another directive called ng-repeat. And this takes the syntax of the name of the local variable we want in our loop and the actual name of the array that holds our data. So it looks like this. We'll say shot in list.shots. Now what happens if we look at our controller is scope.list is, let's just say, undefined. Let's remove that. So there's nothing in list and there's nothing in list.shots. And that's fine. If Angular finds unfound values, it's not going to throw an error. It's just going to treat it as empty and sort of just ignore it. But as soon as our AJAX request goes through and list.shots becomes a real array, it's going to reinterpret the data and create an LI for each shot in shots. And we can use the same double curly braces to access shot as a variable and do something like title. So now the sequence of events that happens is Angular finds the shots list controller and instantiates it. That controller triggers this JSON-P request, which will later update the scope.list variable. When that variable gets updated, it's going to go back to the HTML because we're depending on list.shots, and when that updates, it's going to update this unordered list to have, well, 15 new list items, one for each of our shots. So hopefully, when we refresh, we now see it working. We actually get the titles of each of our items. So we could add to this an image tag. And let's do src equals, and I know that the URL is in shot.image URL, and that's a full-size URL. And we can just leave it there. And you'll notice we can use the curly braces in the attributes of our data. It'll be interpreted properly. So if we refresh, we get the images along with our titles. Now you'll notice there is an actual error being displayed in our page. And that's because of how we set our source. When the page first loads up, there's an image with the source equals double curly braces, and that's not a real image URL, but the browser still tries to fetch it. So Angular has a workaround for this. Instead of putting our source, our dynamic source, in the src tag, instead we place it in the ng-src tag. What this will do is once there's a real value in that ng-src attribute, it'll place it in the source attribute so it can actually attempt to load the image. So if we refresh, we get the same effect, but we don't get those two error calls trying to actually find it. Now I'm going to grab some code from our completed application, and we'll just start it out here. Just clean that up, make sure to close this div. This will clean up the style a little bit, and let's see what we got. And it would help if I spelled thumbnails correctly here. And one more thing that I added in my class, this needs to have a class of shot, and hopefully, still getting some problems. Had some really well thought out styles, and all of a sudden it doesn't work. So let's just take a look, make sure. Oh, and I wanted this to be a span 3. There we go. And now we get our properly created data. And actually, the thumbnail should come off here, and we should get 4 across, and now we're starting to look good. So let's take a look at the code. We just have our simple LI. A lot of this is just boilerplate Bootstrap code here. We're surrounding the A tag in an href tag for linking to another page, which we'll see later. We have our image tag with the ng source attribute, which references shot.image URL. And we have our shot.title here. And we have a link to the player with the shot.player.name. And you can see all these properties if you take a look at the API. For instance, a player has a name, a username, avatar URL, and many other properties along with it. So you can see that we can even access properties from objects inside of objects, just like we do with normal JavaScript using the dot notation. So taking a look at it, it's looking pretty good. And there's actually just a little more we can do using those same techniques. We'll add some stats to it. Looks like I just did that in the wrong order. Let's fix this code up. And paste that new code in. This is just some more information. We're going to print out the views count, comments count, all with some Bootstrap icons and nice styling just at the bottom of each one. So now we can see we have the information about how many views, comments, likes, and rebounds for each of our images. So right now, we're just getting the popular items. It'd be nice if we could do the different ones that are available for that, including debuts and everyone, which we can see if we take a look at shots list here. So instead of popular, we could have everyone and debuts. So there are a couple of steps to get the routing to work where we can have different pages based on the URL that we're currently on. Now, by default, we'll be using the sort of hash URLs here, starting with the # and different URLs. And this will allow us to change the URL in a way that won't reload the page. And Angular can listen to those and update the page when that part of the URL actually changes. So what we're going to do is, first we're going to start off in our app.js. This is our top-level application, and we're going to run app.config. And this takes a function that, again, works with dependency injection, and what we want to retrieve is the route provider. And this is how we're going to define what routes go to what controllers. And so route provider has a .when method, and it takes a pattern. And we'll say, if you go to /list, where this :list is actually a variable, so it could be /popular, /everyone, or /debuts, will all match for this particular route. So when we see that, we want these options to be applied. The first thing we want to say is our controller is our shots list controller. We're putting that in quotes because it'll resolve what a shots list controller is later. And let's use the proper object syntax. And then we need to say our template URL is, and this is where our partials directory works. We'll say partials /shots list.html. So we've defined one of our routes, and we're saying that when we go to /popular or /everyone, we should associate the controller shots list controller with this template that's stored in partials /shots list.html. So let's actually create that partial. We'll create a new file, save it as shots list.html. We're going to take all of the markup from the page that represents our shots list. We're going to cut it out of our index. We're going to place it into our partial. And we're actually going to remove the controller, because remember, in our routes, we defined the controller there. So the actual Angular router is going to figure out what controller should be associated with this piece of code. So we're almost there. The last thing we need to do is inside of our index.html, where we want our page to be displayed, we need to put another div. And it's important that it has ng-view as an attribute. This says this is where the content of our page is going to be. So everything around it is going to be on every page. And the view is just what gets replaced as you go from URL to URL. And that content is defined by this route provider here. So let's see if we typed in everything correctly, and hopefully we get no errors. Now that's good. It looks like we're doing well. Let's go to /popular and see what happens. Awesome. So it recognized that route at #/popular, and it loaded our data for us. Now it'd be nice if by default it redirected us to /popular. So I'm going to reformat this a little bit. I'm going to move when to the next line here. And this when returns the route provider itself, so we can actually chain these together. So as we define more, we can just do more when calls. But actually what I want is an otherwise call. And this is the catch-all. It doesn't take a URL because it's going to match for anything else. And what we'll pass here is redirect to. And then we'll just give it the /popular as where we want it to go. So let's go ahead and save it out. Now we loaded up popular, which is fine, but if we go to the regular /, it's going to automatically redirect us to popular, which triggers this page to show up. So you'll notice that if we hover over these, they're linking to the internal URL shots / and then their ID. But if we click them, it just redirects us to popular. And that's because we don't have a route that matches up with the particular path that we're trying to link to here. So that otherwise kicks in and brings us back. So let's try to implement that shots page. In order to implement the shots page, we'll need to implement a new controller and a new partial to represent it. So let's start with a controller. So we can just do controllers, which is our module, and call controller on it, just like we did before. And you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this code because most of it's the same. Now we're going to call it a shot controller. Let's actually call it a shots controller. And right now we'll just take off this HTTP call that we don't need. Then we also need to define the new partial, which we'll call shot.html. We'll just add some code in here. We'll save it out. And then now we just need to set it up in our routes here. So I'm going to actually copy and paste this. And we'll change this one to register /shots / and we'll call the variable ID. And instead of being a shots list control, we'll call it a shots control. And instead of going to shots list, it'll just go to shot.html. So now if we have everything wired correctly, we don't have any errors. And if we click on one of these, you'll notice the URL did change because it's an acceptable path. And you'll notice our partial loaded up, which means that our controller has also been instantiated our shots controller. So how do we actually get data from the URLs? These are dynamic. These are IDs right here. And /popular should also be working for /everyone, but right now it always loads popular. Well, there's another service, just like scope and HTTP, that we can include into our controllers that will give us access to that URL data, or at least the routing data. So since we had a named variable inside of our routes, which we see here, this one is called ID, and this one is called list. If we grab the route param service, which we can really put in any order here, so we'll say route params, we could console.log route params just to see what it looks like. And so if we go to a list controller here, we'll see that it's just an object that has a list property and the variable everyone. And if we go to popular, it's actually going to refresh the controller, which means that we're going to see a new route param. So every time we update our URL, our controller will be reinstantiated, which means our route params can be reread and we can sort of re-render everything. So what we'll do is we'll take this route params and we'll grab from it a list, which is either going to be everyone or popular or debuts. And we'll say it is route params.list. Then it's actually pretty easy to change what URL we get. Instead of having hard-coded popular here, let's use the correct single quotes. And we'll just inject list right here, save it out. And now it should load up the appropriate API based on which list is passed in. So here's our popular. And if we go to /everyone, we get a different list. And if we go to /debuts, yet another list. Now I'm actually going to update our code with some links to those different routes. So by just updating our UL class here, all they are simple links starting with a hash to the different routes that we want to use. And now we're on our debuts page. We can go to everyone and popular. So now let's go back to our shot page. When we click on it, we don't get anything interesting. But we can use the same ideas that we used for our shots list to continue building out a dynamic page. So the first thing we want to do in our controller is actually grab the data for that particular shot. Now, if we take a look at the Dribbble API documentation, we'll see that it's at shots:ID or /ID. And so that's just the numeric ID that we're going to pass to load up that shot, which will return all of this data regarding that shot. And it's actually remarkably similar to what we did here. We can actually copy and paste, and all we need to do is actually, we really don't have to change anything because they actually both have the same format, just different dynamic parts of it. But I'm going to change this to ID to be a little more clear. And again, we can get var ID from route params.id. And if we're going to use route params, we need to include it by just having a route params argument with that same name. And you'll notice I'm using completely different orders here, but it totally doesn't matter because it looks up them by name. So when we load up this URL, we get the data. And instead of assigning it to .list, I'm going to assign it to .shot. And we'll save it out. So we've refreshed. Now the partial is the same, so we still get the same data, but now we can see what's been brought in from the API. If we open it up here, we can see we have all the information about the shot and the player of that shot available now in our scope.shot variable, which means anywhere in our partial, we can refer to shot and get all the information. So just to demonstrate that, we're going to open up our partial shot.html, and we'll just do the same thing we did before, but with an image. So we'll do an image ng src equals shot.image URL. So now if we refresh, we see we actually get the full image from that particular shot. We can go back, try different shots, and we can see it's completely dynamic and it's fetching the shot data for each individual one at its own URL. Now to fill out this page, we're using pretty much the same techniques that we've used before. So I'm actually going to copy from our completed project the markup for our shot.html. And we'll go over it piece by piece. Basically, we're just utilizing some bootstrap classes to create a grid structure and just sort of some nice information. I'm actually going to we'll go ahead and remove this line here, and we'll explain this in a moment. So let's see if it worked. Go to this shot here, and you can see it's nicely laid out. I spent some time sort of putting the grid system on it. We can see information about who posted it, the title of it. We'll be able to load in responses, hopefully if we have time. And if there are rebounds, we could load them in here. But you can see we just have some of the dynamic information about how many likes, views, rebounds, and comments were placed in it. And we can try that out for any other shot. Looking at the code, most of it is just basic HTML. We have our image here using ng source. And this is the avatar for the player. So it's stored in the shots player object in its avatar URL, which we can see in this example here for shots ID. There's a player object inside of that. There's an avatar URL. And so it's pretty easy to put together a dynamic image based on that information. Then we can grab its title, the player's name. We're linking to the player's page, which is, if we have time to implement, would be nice. But using the same techniques, you could probably implement that yourself. And then we just have a couple more columns. And down here is where we actually have all of the counts for likes, comments, and so on. And then I just have a normal link here to the actual Dribbble page for that. So one thing I wanted here is the date for when this was posted. And if we actually look at the proper Dribble page, we can see December 5th, 2012. And it's actually included in the API. So if we were to go up here, and on this page, we could say shot.createdAt. Now, if we refresh our page, we can see that createdAt is being put out, but it's just a string. It's not really well formatted. And that's where we can use something called a filter. Now, going over a filter, it has a special syntax. So right now we're just doing shot.createdAt, which just puts out the string. But filters are using this pipe key and then the name of a filter we want to use. So for instance, one of the filters is uppercase. And so the way the filter syntax works is it takes the value on the left side of the pipe and passes it to the filter on the right side. So it's saying, take this createdAt, pass it to uppercase, and then output the information. So if we refresh, well, there's no words here. So I'm going to actually just change this to be something like hello. And you'll notice we can just put a default value in here. This doesn't have to be a variable. It can be a literal string. And if we refresh, we can see our hello has now been uppercased by this. And there is actually a date formatting filter, which we can see at the documentation here. If we scroll down this side here to the filters, we'll see there's one for date. And it will take the date and it will take an argument with the format string, which is either manually put together like this or some of these pre-built ones by name. So if we take shot.createdAt, pass it to date, and the way we pass in this format string is by putting a colon and then the format string that we want, in our case, let's say MMMD, YYY, which should be the short name for the month in words, the day of the month, and then the 4-digit year. So if this worked, we should see it properly formatted. However, it doesn't. And that's because the way that the built-in date format works, it can't actually parse this particular sequence of date. However, we can write our own filter that can parse it. So let's see how to write a filter in Angular. You'll notice we have a filters.js file ready to go. So I'm going to do the same thing by creating a module called filters. This could be anything. I'm just storing it in a variable called filters for now. We do that with angular.modules. We'll call it dabble.filters. It'll take nothing. And in order for it to work, we need to include it in this array here, dabble.filters. So in order to define a filter on this module that we have stored in filters, we'll call .filter and give it the name of the filter that we want to create. And I'll call it dabble date. And now we're going to pass it a function. Now this function isn't the actual filter. This function is a function that will actually return the filter. And the reason we have this, again, is for the dependency injection. The arguments to this function are the actual services or dependencies that we need in order to implement it. And we'll see what those are in a moment, but right now we'll leave nothing. And then we actually need to return the filter. And a filter has at least one argument, which is the value. And then the filter must return something. And we'll just say, right now, it'll do something. So now it's registered that new filter. Now if we go to shot.html, and instead of running it through date here, we ran it through dabble date. What we should see is, well, right now we're seeing an error, and it's probably because I mistyped something in our filter. Yep, I put an S on modules here. Just take that off, and we'll refresh and see if we got it. There we go. Now we can see our filter returns something no matter what's passed into it. So let's actually take a look at what happens. Value. Now a filter can also take an argument, and in our case that would be the format. And that's passed in after the colon when we actually execute it. So let's just console.log them to see what we're getting, and we'll leave the something in place. Now if we take a look at the bottom, we'll see that we get a couple of calls where both format and the value are both undefined. Then later on, we actually get the string, and I don't think we're actually passing in the format. We aren't. So let's update that, MMM_DYYYY. By refreshing that, there we go. We can see the format's always passed in, but until we get the data, it's going to try to run the filter with no value, and then once it gets the data, it's going to try to run the filter with the data. So in our filter, we have to handle whether or not our actual data is there, because it may be called with undefined. So what we'll do here is say if value, and the way we can get a useful date out of that string is by calling date.parse, and that's the built-in date value. So we'll say value equals date.parse value. And then I don't want to worry about all that formatting stuff. I just want to pass it off to the existing filter. And so we can actually access those other filters by including in our dependency here the $filter. And this actually stores all of our filters so we can access them. So instead of returning something, I want to return the filter. And to get a filter by name, we just execute the function. We want to get the date filter. And this returns the function, which, like our filter, takes a value and a format, which we can pass in directly. So what we're doing is we're writing our own filter that simply parses the value and then passes it off to an existing filter and returns that value. So if we do everything right, we now get our properly formatted date. So you can use that to write your own filter anytime you want to format your data in some way on your page easily. That's how you create a filter. Now, one last thing I don't really like is that we're doing our JSON calls inside of our controller. It would be nice if we had just another module called, let's say, dribble, that we could ask for, and then do something like dribble.list, pass in the list, and then do .then and update our information, instead of having to really worry about where the API is from inside our controller. And we can do that using a service. Just like we're able to retrieve HTTP and route params, we can define our own services that will be accessible in the exact same way. And we'll do that in our services module. So once again, we'll do var, we'll call it services, equals angular.module. We'll call it dabble.services. It depends on nothing else. And in order to create a service, we'll call on our module the factory method. And a factory just associates a name that will be, in our case, dribble. This is how, when we call things by name, this is the name that it actually matches it against. And then we are going to give it a function. And again, this is the function that will return the actual value for dribble. And this function itself can take in dependencies. And since I'm pretty sure we're going to be using the HTTP module, I'll make HTTP, that service, a dependency of this service. And then I just need to return something that will be the actual value of dribble that's passed in. And I'm going to return an object that has functions on it. So for instance, list would be a function that takes the type and returns some http.jsonp call, right? So we're going to move this data right here. I'm going to cut that out. And we're going to put it in our services.js here. And we'll replace type, our list here with type. And now if we go to our controllers, we can actually do this. So it'll look up dribble. It'll find it because we've defined a factory with the name dribble. And it will pass as the dribble parameter this object. This object has a list method on it, which takes a type and returns that JSONP promise, which means back in our controller, we can take that promise, call then to extract the data from it, and have it work just like that. Now, of course, the last step is to make sure that our services module is also a dependency. And we'll do that right here, dabble.services. So if we do everything right, we should get no errors, and our list page should still work. Now, the whole point of this is that we can reduce the duplication here. So we'll do dribble.shot ID, and this will have the same plan. Now, of course, we need to implement shot in our Dribble service. Now, we could just copy and paste this. However, all of our different endpoints are going to be pretty similar, so I'm going to factor that out into a local function here we'll call load. And it'll take a path, and we're going to also say it takes params. And it will take this, we'll cut this, and we'll say return load / shots plus type. And we'll change this so instead of hard coding shots in here, the variable will be the path. And at least on this page, we shouldn't get any errors. We've just refactored it. But now adding a shot function, which takes a type, can return load / shots plus ID. And I meant for it to take ID, not type. Even though they're the same URL, I like to keep them separate just so their meaning is clear in our code. So now, I think what I forgot to do is include Dribble. Yep. So I didn't add Dribble as a property or an argument or dependency of our shots controller. And since I don't need HTTP anymore, I'll replace HTTP with Dribble. And I can actually remove HTTP from this one as well. So now we're back to where we started, and everything works out. So the last cool feature that I want to do is we're only getting 15 here, but there are multiple pages. And if we take a look at the documentation, we'll see that, for instance, our shots list page accepts pagination parameters. That means we can pass in page and per page in order to get the correct pages. So this is going to actually require us to do something a little bit different. First thing I'm going to do is in our list here, at the end of our list, I'll add a button. And we'll give it an ng-click of, and we'll say load next page. Load more, close out the button. So if we take a look at the UI now, we should have a button at the bottom, and it won't do anything because we haven't implemented load next page. So going to our shots list controller, all we need to do is specify scope.load next page equals a function. And so what do we want to do? Well, I want to do dribble.list, but I don't want to grab the same page again. I actually want to grab the next page. So we're going to update how dribble.list works so it accepts a params argument that's an object of the query parameters we want to pass. So the query parameter we want to pass is page, and the value of it is actually going to be calculated from the existing data we have. Remember, scope.list has already been loaded at this point, hopefully. We can handle the edge cases if it hasn't. And scope.list has the current page that's been loaded. And so we can just add 1 to it. And then we can do then grab its data like we have before, and then we'll figure out what to do with it. For now, we'll just console.log the data. Now, in order for this to do anything, we have to go update our service to accept that second parameter. So in our services here, in our list, we will take params, and we'll just pass them through to load. And we're going to make it so load has params as an optional object, so it'll default to a regular empty object. So we'll say params equals either params if it exists or an empty object. Now, right now, we currently have our params hard-coded into our URL, but we can change that around, and we can actually load it as an object. So we can say params.callback equals JSON callback. And instead of appending it here, we can pass a second argument to JSONP, which is our options. And one of those options is called params, and it takes an object of keys and values that params matches up with. So now if we refresh, everything should work. And if we click on Load More, we're going to see our console.log here. And if we open up the data, we can see it's page 2. So it's passed through the page appropriately when we did Load Next Page. Now to actually get it to update, we'll go back to our controller. And one thing we could do is the same thing we did before. Scope.list equals data.data. So now if we refresh, if we click Load More, what's going to happen is once it loads, we're going to get an error. If I spell scope with one O appropriately, we should get rid of that error. Trying it one more time, if we click Load More, you'll see that it actually swapped out for the second page. That's not quite what I want. I want it to add to the end. So instead of switching all that out, I can actually do something a little bit different. Instead of saying scope.list equals the whole thing, first thing I'm going to do is update the page on the current scope.list. So I'll say scope.list.page equals data.data.page, which now means that scope.list.page is the latest page. So if we run load next page again, this calculation will continue to increase. Now to add the data.data.shots to the scope.data.shots, what we can do is scope.list.shots equals scope.list.shots.concat data.data.shots. And what this will do is it will set the shots to the original shots list with the new shots added to the end. And of course, Angular, as it sees that change update, it's going to re-render the page with that new longer list of shots. So let's give it a try. There we go. We have our first page of 15. And if we load more, it loads in right after it. And hopefully, because it's updating the page, and every time we do load next page, it calculates one page greater, we can continue loading as much as we want. Now, there are a lot of other things we can do to sort of clean up this code. I didn't have a whole lot of time to go over all of Angular, but hopefully you got an idea for how to create controllers, some services, even some filters, and how to interact with some JSON APIs fairly easily with the built-in tools. If we take a look at the full application, which will be included, you can see a little more advanced version of what we have built here. It's still using the same concepts, but it works a little more on the show page. For instance, there's comments, and we can load the comments using just another Dribble API call, which we've done similarly in our code. And it even has paged comments that can load more as we go. So I urge you to take a look at the code, explore, play around with AngularJS. It's a really great framework. It's easy to get up and running. And once you learn how to define your own services and filters and even your own directives, you can actually really build anything you want. The real power is in building your own directives, which we didn't get to do here. It's a little more complex and a little more involved, but once you get that, you'll be able to even create your own new HTML tags and attributes that have their own functionality associated with them. So check it out at angularjs.org, and you can grab the code for both the beginning, what we've done here, as well as the larger fleshed out application by just clicking download. I'm Jim Hoskins. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more, check out teamtreehouse.com for more great resources on web design, web development, and more.